let's begin with some developments in the polity. It is a busy day for justices of the Supreme Court as they deliver judgment on the election petition appeals from 4 states, including Kogi and Imo. The court has now affirmed the re-election of Doyodiri as governor of Bayelsa State and dismissed the appeal filed by the candidate of the APC, Tinubu, Silva, in the state's 2023 governorship election for lacking in merit. Justice Lawal Garba upheld the judgment of the Court of Appeals delivered on the 15th of July 2024. The appellate court had held that for filing 2 notices of appeal, Mr. Silva abused the court's processes. The apex court's position is that an appellant has the right to one's notice of appeal and not multiple. Counsel to Governor Doyodiri Chris Uche commended the judgment.
We are very happy that today again, Governor Doyodiri has won. You will recall that this has been a series of victories affirming his victory at the election. At the election tribunal, we won. At the Court of Appeal, we won. And today, too, at the Supreme Court, the final court, the highest court of the land, we have also won, affirming his victory at the polls. So we are very happy that the appeal filed by Silva has been dismissed, having been found by the Supreme Court to amount to a gross abuse of court process.
Similarly, the Supreme Court also dismissed the appeal filed by the Social Democratic Party and its candidate, Murtala Jaka, for lacking in merit and substance in the Kogi State governorship tussle. Let's take a short break, and when we return, it will be time to discuss matters of diplomacy as the UN chief calls for permanent Africa Security Council seats. With my guest, Ademola Oshodi. Please stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. The United Nations chief has called for the UN Security Council to reform its outdated structure and assign Africa a permanent seat at the table, stressing that the continent is underrepresented. The 15-member UNSC consists of 5 permanent members with veto power, countries like China, France, Russia, the United States and United Kingdom, while the remaining 10 non-permanent seats are located regionally. The 10 seats include 3 seats for African states, 2 each for Asia Pacific, Latin American and the Caribbean, Western Europe and other states, and 1 for East Europe. Addressing the council during a high-level debate, Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the composition of the UNSC has failed to keep pace with a changing world. And according to him, we cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people. Nor can we accept that Africa's views are undervalued on questions of peace and security, both on the continent and around the world. And so the big question tonight is Africa ready? And whether or not a permanent seat would translate into real influence on global issues. So let's have this conversation tonight. And joining me from our Abuja studio is Ademola Oshodi, Senior Special Assistant to the President on Protocol, is also a foreign policy analyst. Good evening to you, Mr. Ademola. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to Politics Tonight.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Right, so nearly 80 years after its creation, how do you describe this historic injustice of Africa's non-representation in the permanent category and underrepresentation in the non-permanent category? Do you agree with Sierra Leone President Julius Maada Bio and others who have called this a direct outcome and continuing legacy of the wrongs of slavery and colonialism?
I'm not sure I will take it as far as slavery and colonialism. It's not just Africa that's been left out of the Security Council. There's also Asian countries. There's also quite big and powerful and rich European countries that have emerged after the war. The UN was created after World War II for the victors of the war. So countries that have become global powers like Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, have not been included. So it's not just a colonial thing. So Nigeria and Africa, I would say, have been excluded, and not just in the Security Council, but in many organizations around the world. We're almost like an afterthought. The bygone era of having just 5 permanent members of the Security Council is way past its due date. We need a situation whereby reform is definitely on the offing. A situation whereby Africa will have a seat there, not just a seat, but have a permanent seat, and be able to deliberate with all the other great powers. Africa has a population of over 1 billion people, led by Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, and the rest. It is quite a disservice for the continent to be underrepresented in such an esteemed council. And this is the clarion call that nations that are emerging and that are quite powerful in their own right, whether regionally or continentally, should have a seat on the table. Because as one of my friends used to tell me, if you're not on the table, then you're on the menu. So we need to be on the table.
You hear some analysts say African attempts to have better representation aren't new, but it's different now because current geopolitics have made this current moment quite favorable for them, and there is a competition for Africa's vote. But from your own point of view, is Africa ready?
Africa is ready. Not just Africa is ready. The United Nations Security Council is ready for reform. It's ready to receive a larger group of countries, group of nations representing a different geopolitical interest and concerns. Where the world is dealing with issues of conflict, climate change, migration, and also issues around ethnic and insurgencies in different places, not just in Africa, but you find places in Burma. You have places around in Southern America. So we need an expansion of that council. Africa is ready in the fact that regardless of the situation, economic or political situation of African countries, it's still a force to be with. China, when China was a Security Council member, when it was invited, China was not a well-developed country. And we see what China is now. We think about other countries. India is a force in Asia, and so is Brazil. Nigeria has a massive population. It is the giant of Africa, regardless of what the political challenges or economic challenges we may have. You can't take that away from it. It's a population of about 200 million people. It sits in the helm of ECOWAS and African Union. It's a leader. Nigeria is a natural leader in Africa. There's no reason why Nigeria should not have that chair. I mean, I don't want to come across as being biased, but there's really no other country. South Africa is well developed, but South Africa is just a well-developed country. It's not a natural leader. Even Ethiopia has a better stake than, I think, South Africa in seeking the seats. But Africa is definitely ready, and I think it has to be sub-Saharan Africa. The Northern Africa, the Arabs, the Maghrebs do have their interest in Africa, but they also have their interest in the Middle East. They have their interest in Asia. So African continent, sub-Saharan Africa should be well represented as a permanent member on that council.
But if we're to look at it from the angle of representation and influence, would a permanent seat translate into real influence on global issues, or would it be largely symbolic without meaningful power?
Well, it's once you have that veto, you have power. So that gives you power, that gives you strength, that gives you relevance. People will sit up and listen. If Russia, United States, or China vetoes a United Nations resolution, then we know that they have to be negotiation. They have to find a way to water down or increase the essence of the resolution. They have a say. As long as you have a permanent seat with a veto, you have a say. Interest of Africa, especially in areas where we had conflicts, where we could not make a say. We had conflicts in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, we had in Congo, Brazzaville, in Congo, DRC, in Mozambique, and of course, we can't forget Rwanda. We did not have a say. We could not dictate if the United Nations would send troops, peacekeepers, to help the continent, to help the people. We were not on the table. In many cases, we were an afterthought. So the re-engineering of that council is not just imperative, it's a necessity. It is to really provide the general clout, the continent of 1 billion people, black people, should have a say on that seat. Right now it's a seat of white Caucasians and Chinese. So it has to be quite a very obvious diversity, and it has to be a very obvious intervention towards that.
So if you say power is enough, how then do you think Africa should ensure that a permanent seat leads to substantial outcomes?
A permanent seat will, as I said, give us that authority, that veto power, if necessary, to be able to determine what affects the continent. We can then hopefully ensure areas that does not even directly, for instance, well, I would say directly affect us, like climate change, for instance. The Western countries are the biggest culprits for climate issues. They are the biggest emitters. But Africa and the global South are the ones that are getting the brunt of it. We don't have the economic power to leverage ourselves against it, to protect ourselves. Our beaches, our rivers, our deserts. There's tremendous amount of anguish of the change in the climate. Weather's getting really hot, or it gets really, really wet. It gets flooded. People die, and this causes insecurity. It's a national security issue. We have people migrating from different parts of the country or the continent for a better life, which causes stress with the indigents or the natives of those places. So with a seat in the United Nations, we can better address our unique challenges and ensure that we are on that table, and we are, basically our words, our intentions are well taken care of. So it's I cannot stress it enough that Africa's seat has to be on that table on a permanent basis. We are well underrepresented in global affairs. We are quite an afterthought, and it's time for things to change, to have more equality in decision-making that affect not just Nigeria, Africa, but the general, Earth. We have to be there as a big player, in getting our word in.
I mean, if you would agree with me, criteria for selection is something that may look like a challenge. So how will the continent decide which African country will represent the entire region? Should the seats be rotational among African countries, or should a specific country permanently hold the seat? What exactly are the criteria for selection?
That's the challenge. That is the challenge. Obviously, you can't have Nigeria without South Africa complaining, or Egypt there without, Algeria, or even, Ethiopia. And, you have other, emerging economies, we have that are actually have a lot of clout with their colonial masters and with also regional blocs in Africa. So how is it done? As I said, Nigeria is a natural leader. South Africa is an economic, well-developed country. Ethiopia is an emerging African economy with a colossal population. And you have Egypt that has African interest, but also Middle East concerns. They're also a big player there. My suggestion is, obvious number one would be have Nigeria, without being biased, of course, Nigeria as the natural leader taking the position. But another way around it, which some analysts have mentioned, is to have African Union send a representative representing the African Union. So African Union would be having the seat on the United Nations with also veto power. And same thing that could be done with the European Union. Germany, a very big player in the world, is not a United Nations Security Council. So what stops the European Union having a seat on the council with the same powers and the provisions of a permanent member? What stops the Southern American, Latin American countries also having their association represented there? If there's a dispute in having one country representing the interests of those regions, it is contentious. It is very contentious. That's one of the biggest challenges. Who takes the seat? And it's, again, as I said, it's not just a uniquely African continental issue. It is a global issue. There's also some countries that have, problems with another country, maybe historically or for whatever reason. And each country has their own unique challenges. Each country has a unique benefits.
I asked the question because for Sierra Leone president, he's saying that the African Union will choose the African permanent members. I mean, it says Africa wants the veto abolished. However, if UN member states wish to retain the veto, it must be extended to all new permanent members as a matter of justice. So, I mean, for the purpose of clarity and emphasis, what would be the implications of having or not having that power?
Not having the veto power?
Absolutely.
It would actually make quite a difference in global issues, in global negotiations, in finding actual resolution. If it's just like what the General Assembly does, which is a general vote of a majority, having a General Assembly vote which is not really binding is, we get a lot of decisions made from that. So if they remove the veto, we could have tremendous progress. We have issues of the Russians or former USSR and America, stalling, the United Nations resolutions and United Nations actions. We also have China taking a play. You have France and you have UK supporting, Western interest. So you find the United Nations is bogged down with this veto component. So if they remove that, it will take it will really, really go a long way. But will the major powers want that? Russia, it's a declining force in the world. They need that presence, that veto, to be able to check Western interest, Western counterbalances against their moves. For instance, in Ukraine, you also have America, checkmating any action happening in the Middle East, Israel, or Iran, anything like that. So it would go a long way in getting progress done, especially just having a majority vote. And again, it will in many ways whittle down the power, the presence, and the essence of many of these permanent 5 members, that in many ways have been dominating this council since 1945. So the global West, which is the Western countries, America, Europe, Japan, and South Korea, they have dominated their interest in the world. Now you're finding the emergence of the global East, which is places like China, and the rising force of China. I think it's really dominated by China. And then you have the global South, which is, of course, led by India, led by Brazil, Nigeria. Those countries do want a place on that table. And you find, because of this exclusion, you find them in the G77 group of nations, nations of developing countries. They feel excluded. Now they're having to deliberate about issues concerning the global south against the rich global north. So bringing them in and their interest into this enlarged, reformed Security Council without a veto, I hope, should have progress. We should have more of a democratic institution there, rather than the bygone era that is seen in the Security Council at the moment.
All right. So I think it's also very important for us to talk about preparedness and cohesion. I mean, the conversation out there is the African Union prepared to take a unified stance on key global security issues? Can the continent's leaders agree on a cohesive foreign policy agenda that reflects Africa's diverse interests? How best can we achieve this?
We can vote at the African Union. We can have a vote. We can have, votes could be from the regional blocs, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, the Southern African Group, East African Group, the North African Group. You could have it, on a general assembly format where majority. We could rotate it and have Nigeria be a member, with a permanent member of the UN, and then South Africa takes over Ethiopia, Egypt, and any other force, emerging force, natural leader, or economic giant in Africa to also play a role. The most important thing here is, what we're missing the point is, ensuring Africa's interest is protected. Obviously, it would be considered weird if a small African country is leading the rest of the 1 billion populated continent. But the key here is to ensure we have respect, leadership, and the natural leaders are the countries I just mentioned. And I believe they will push for the interest of their region, sub-region in Africa, and also for the continent itself. We all know what Nigeria's role is with the Economic Community of West Africa, with ECOWAS. Nigeria has pivoted peace enforcement, especially in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. Nigeria has provided tremendous amount of peacekeepers for the United Nations over the decades, from the 60s, almost from the inception of independence. Nigeria has played a role in East Africa. Nigeria has provided training with the technical aid corps, training for least developed African countries and even Caribbean countries. Nigeria has also ensured we have, democracy in many parts of West Africa, ensuring that peace is kept. Nigeria has also provided support for the liberation of South Africa, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Nigeria has played a role in also ensuring that we find in the Sahel, even beyond ECOWAS, with Chad, we have issues with insecurity. Nigeria has played a pivotal role there. Nigeria has provided the ground for assistance for many North African countries. We championed areas of the Western Sahara for a while. So Nigeria has played that leadership role, and it will continue to play it as a permanent member of the United Nations. It is a natural leader, as I said. And South Africa has been relatively new. Sorry?
I hear you, but I mean, is global perception a challenge? How does the rest of the world perceive Africa's demand for a permanent seat? Africa's calls for inclusion being taken seriously by the existing powers? Well,
this is it. 2/3 of the United Nations, 2/3, I say, are from the global south, from developing countries. They are the majority. They really are the majority. I mean, so why shouldn't they have a bigger say? Africa is another big giant of 1 billion people. How does that counts as a continent, as a race that should be excluded. And it is, they would, I hear people say that power is not given a la carte, it's not given on a platter. You have to fight for it. I don't see those big 5 permanent members given it easily. But they need to understand that the world has changed. The world is now not just the West. We have the rising power of China. We have the rising power of India. We have, a lot of attention from Saudi Arabia, a big Middle East power. There's also Brazil calling shots. It's not just one state, one dominant state influencing the rest of the world anymore. There are big rising powers, and we have to take that into consideration. It's just it's a necessity in international affairs, whereby if you want peace and harmony in a world whereby things are changing, affecting everybody. We live in a very interrelated world with issues of climate change. How do you address climate change when the emitters are the ones controlling the reins of power? So Africa, being the least developed place in the world, it also has tremendous potential. It's going to be one of the biggest places in the world regarding population in the next few decades. Are they going to be not included? I doubt that, and I think it just has to be a continuous negotiation. Yes.
Mr. Oshodi, let's come back home. So how does Africa plan to address its own internal conflicts? I mean, talk about governance challenges and economic disparities while taking on the responsibility of a permanent UNSC seat.
How does Africa deal with it itself? Is that what you said?
Absolutely. And I ask that question because there are those who say no region dramatizes Africa's contrast of opportunity and risk more than the continent's West. An example is the last meeting of the 3 defiant military rulers. Many say that meeting reflects a commonly seen image of West Africa. So overall, can Africa's role on the Council help to address these issues?
Yes, Africa is dealing with issues of governance, and we turned the table since the 90s. There was more of a democratic representation in most African countries. Obviously, the past few years we've had we've been backsliding with in West Africa with Burkina Faso, with Guinea, with Mali, and of course with Niger. We've had a tested moment in Senegal. We've had issues around in East Africa with Congo Brazzaville, and we've had challenges in Chad with after the assassination or the death, of Deby, President Deby in Chad. So it is quite an unfortunate situation that has happened regarding the testing of democracy, but it does not necessarily mean that we should not have a representation. China is not a democratic country, but China plays a big role in the United Nations and in global affairs. So though Nigeria and Africa is developing, it is an opportunity for also to ensure that the system that situation is well democratized with equal diversity.
All right. Thank you so much for your time with us tonight. Ademola Oshodi, Senior Special Assistant to the President on Protocol, and is also a foreign policy analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on Politics Tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's take a break now, and when we return, we will shift our attention to judicial reforms in Nigeria as judges get pay rise, and I will be speaking with Libros Oshoma. Please stay with us.